Hey guys, Teacher Amy here, and today I wanted to talk to you about what to expect when online teaching. I'm frequently reading on the message boards of people being disappointed with their experiences with a number of different companies or just with the entire experience in general. So I wanted to make this video to help you manage your expectations. Okay, there are a lot of advertisements out there making this out to be like the dream job, online teaching, and it does definitely have its benefits. It definitely has its benefits. I'm choosing not to work in a brick and mortar high school, which is what I was accustomed to doing and had done for 10 years because of the benefits, really the intangible benefits to my life from working online, being able to work remotely from home, from anywhere. And the flexibility that offers. That's fantastic. But it's not all sunshine and roses. Like, it is a job. So on that note, I wanted to make clear sort of some things that you should really consider before you decide to teach online, and decide if you can handle them or not. Because if you can't, then maybe this is not the job for you. Maybe you should look into something else. So some things that I would consider. Number one, time zone issues. If you work in the United States, this job kind of sucks for you because almost all of the highest paying companies are based in China. So they're based on peak times in Beijing, which are after school hours in Beijing. Now, if you live in Eastern Europe, after school hours in Beijing is like right in the middle of the afternoon. It's like 1 to 4. It's the best. It's the best schedule ever. But if you live in the United States, man, if you live on the East Coast, that's between, I believe, 6 and 9 a.m. Pretty early day. And if you have a day job you have to go to, that might conflict and you may not be able to do both. Or you may only be able to do some of those hours because other part of those hours is in your day job. If you're a regular high school teacher like I was, or elementary school teacher, whatever, some of those hours are your regular work time. So you're not going to be able to work all those hours anyway. So it would be very, very part-time for you. And if you live on the West Coast in Pacific time, it's like 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Those are the hours you'd be working. I mean, who wants to do that? Where you live makes a difference with whether or not this is convenient. Now, there are other companies besides the ones based in China, but the ones that are based in China pay the most, no question about that. And out of all the companies that I found, the ones with the highest salaries are all based in China. So it's something to think about. If you're in the United States, this job might be really crummy hours for you. Number two, bookings take time. A lot of these companies, it can take time to build up regular classes. And even if the company books for you, which Bling ABC does, Dada ABC and Magic Ears also do, you still may not have a full schedule right away. This is very normal, especially if, depending on when you get hired. A lot of these companies have like hiring cycles. Bling ABC especially does because it's based on terms. But even other schools that basically function year-round without any breaks do still have peak hiring times or peak hiring seasons. And so depending on when you're hired, you may have to wait a bit to get a regular schedule, and that's pretty normal. It's not something people often advertise, but it's quite common. There are some companies you can get booked like instantly right away, and I've had that happen as well. The fastest for me in terms of getting booked quickly were definitely VIP Kid, GoGo Kid, and Dada ABC. These three companies, I was able to get classes relatively quickly. The main issue was if I stopped doing it for any period of time, getting booked again was then quite difficult. But I was able to get trial lessons. Something else people don't tell you about when you first start at a lot of these companies, you're going to be doing mostly trial lessons, which means you never see the student again. It's more like they're testing out the platform to see if they like it and want to sign up. And cancellations are very common. It's extremely common for a trial lesson to be canceled because the parents aren't paying for it. So there's not really much investment in it. So it's easy for them to just not show up. And that's pretty common. So be prepared for that. And a lot of these companies will offer you some pay for that, which is cool. Some offer 50%, some offer 60%, and some offer 100%. But after a while, sitting and waiting in front of the computer for a student to show up and only getting paid half time for that time when you could have taught a lesson and made double that, or whatever, depending on which company, over time you kind of get tired of that and it feels like a waste of your time. Number 3, policies change. Policies change all the time, sometimes without notice. Data ABC used to offer you half of your regular rate if you were on standby. You didn't have a class scheduled, but they might add one at the last minute. But I've been reading on the message boards about that they recently changed a policy for student no-shows. If the class wasn't canceled and you show up to the class, they're like now giving you a lower rate for sitting and waiting in front of the camera than they used to. And they changed that without the consent of the teachers. They just like randomly changed the policy. And so you have to keep in mind these contracts are not easy to be enforced. So really your only option, if the company's not following the contract, is to simply leave and go elsewhere. You don't really have a lot of other recourse as an independent contractor. 4, teaching requires a lot of energy. You are talking a lot in this job, especially with lower students, because they need more output from you to listen than the older students do. So you are talking a lot. And you're doing it in varied voices, loud, soft. You're really exercising your throat. Seriously. And you don't start to notice that maybe until the end of a shift where you've been talking a lot and you're like, talking that much for that long really can take a toll. I can tell you right now, you're definitely going to do a lot more talking with online teaching than you would in a traditional brick and mortar classroom, because you're the one directing everything that's happening in the online classroom, and you're not physically there with the students. So your voice and your body are the 2 primary ways that you're communicating with them through the internet. And with some of these companies, breaks are really limited. With GoGo Kid and VIP Kid, it's usually a 25-minute lesson with a 5-minute break in between. But during that break, you're often putting in feedback. So maybe it's only really a couple minutes by the time you're done with that, if you choose to use it for that. But still, 5 minutes and then another one. And you might have, 6, 10 of those in a row. I mean, when you're teaching regular lessons in a row, it can really take it out of you. It can really be an exhausting job, especially with a bad lesson or one where you really have to try to coach the students to participate. It can take a lot out of you, especially if you're doing this at like 3 to 6 in the morning. So that's something to consider. With Data ABC, there were 2-minute breaks in between each class, which is barely enough time to exit the class, maybe stand up and stretch, and then enter the next class. It's really not enough time to do anything. That's another thing I appreciate about Bling ABC, actually, is that they have 10-minute breaks in between each 40-minute class, which may seem short to some people, but man, compared to some of these other companies, that is a very luxurious 10-minute break. I have enough time to make some tea, stand up, stretch, maybe go to the bathroom. It's actually a proper break. And even if my class runs over a little bit, which happens sometimes too, I still have plenty of break left. When I only have a 2-minute or a 5-minute break, if class runs long, you really don't get a break and you're just on to the next class. So that's another thing to think about. All of those things combined, a lot of talking and limited breaks, it really can be taxing on you, and it requires a lot of energy output on your part, especially if you want to keep getting booked. If you're not having fun, the kids aren't having fun either, and they can really sense your energy if you're like, if you're yawning a lot, they're going to be yawning a lot, and it's going to be a really boring class, and it's going to be a struggle. So energy is really important in online teaching, especially because when you're not physically in the space with the students, your energy is even more important because it has to penetrate through the screen. Number 5, culture shock. Again, since most of these companies are based in China, or at least the best paying ones are, there are some very real cultural differences to consider. For example, nakedness. That nakedness is so common in online teaching that there are actually policies about it with some companies. To be honest, some don't really mention it at all, and it hasn't been a problem for me. But I know that Magic Ears specifically has a policy regarding this, and you have the right to turn off their camera and report why if that happens. So far, I've been lucky not to see any like full frontal nakedness, although I've definitely have some colleagues who have. But I have frequently seen like an uncle or a father or a grandfather walking by in his boxer shorts. That's a pretty common thing, like in the background behind the students. So you just kind of get used to those things. Or oftentimes parents will try to get more bang for their buck, so they'll have multiple kids in front, all trying to like absorb at the same time. So you might have a brother or a sister come in that you weren't expecting. This happens a lot. Hovering parents. A lot of parents will be sitting right next to their kid off screen or sometimes even on screen, and they're telling them what to do, and sometimes that contradicts what you're telling them to do, and it's a frustrating situation. Sometimes the parents are super helpful, and having them there for moral support is really great, especially at first, because a lot of these students are very, very nervous. And in their regular school, they're trained not to talk. So we're trying to get them to talk, and that's exactly what they're being told not to do all day long at school. So it's very, very different. It's a challenge to get them to try to engage, because education in the West is very different than in the East, and especially in China. A lot of the students are eating during class or maybe attending class on the go. I can't tell you the number of students I've had that are clearly in a car or a vehicle, or sometimes even walking in between buildings, like because they're on their way home from some other lesson back home for dinner, and then this lesson's being squeezed in between. I mean, some of these students in China, they have lessons all day long, and so they're very busy, and they're often attending your class en route. In which case, you may not have their full attention. And that's just something you have to deal with. Number 6, unpaid time. This is something people don't think about either. The rates you're being quoted by these companies are usually per lesson. Now you can calculate that into an hourly rate pretty quickly depending on whatever formula is appropriate for how long your lessons are. But what a lot of people don't talk about is all the outside time that you have to put into this job in order to even show up for those lessons. You're only going to be paid for your actual teaching time. But almost all of these companies also require that you provide feedback for your students after the class. And that is unpaid time. You do not get paid for that time. So that's something else to factor in. You're going to have to make time for it in your day because there are deadlines for it. Usually it has to be, at max within a day, sometimes shorter than that, depending on the company. And that's something you are required to do. And if you don't, you will get fired immediately, because that feedback to the parents is really important to the company. And you don't get paid for that. Some of the companies, it requires more time than others to do that. Some of them have standard forms where you can just tick, different boxes and write a really brief thing. Others, you have to write like a full paragraph. And for each kid, if you have a class with 3 kids, and you're teaching, 4+ classes, that can really add up to a lot of feedback that you're going to be writing at the end. And you have to remember at least some detail about each one in order to write some sort of relevant feedback. So that's an additional challenge that people often don't warn you about. Also, there's training. Most of these companies do not offer paid training. Bling EBC's initial training was paid. However, there are also additional trainings you can opt in for if you want that are unpaid. A lot of these companies are offering training or even requiring training, but you're not getting paid for it, so that's additional time. Not to mention the time that it takes to set up your space or your classroom and all of those other things. Or the investment of the equipment itself, the camera, the computer, the props, etc. So it's really something to think about, all the outside time and money that you are investing into being an independent contractor. And on that note, my last and final thing to consider, adapting is key. And that's true of any teacher, whether you're in a brick and mortar classroom or you're teaching online. If you cannot adapt to the situation, this job is really not for you. anything can happen in an online classroom. Anything could be presented to you in front of the camera. You have no control over what's happening on the other side of that camera. Technical issues may arise at the last minute. If you're working for more than one company, you're going to have to learn and really practice all the platforms because they're different. And so what you're doing is different in each one, and you need to be aware of that. There's really a lot to learn. Now, all that being said, obviously, I still prefer teaching online to working in a regular school, or else I wouldn't be doing it. There are plenty of benefits and reasons to teach online. But I just wanted to be honest with you guys about some of the pitfalls that people don't really talk about so that you're aware of them before you apply. And just so that you have realistic expectations and don't put yourself in a situation where you're relying on income that isn't coming yet. Because I'm seeing a lot of people have issues with this. You really need to be patient when it comes to building up a regular schedule. And generally, it's not a good idea to rely too heavily on one company. You might find a company you end up loving, just like I did, and give most of your hours to them. But it's also a good idea to have a backup or just another company if you need extra hours for some reason. If there's a public holiday and your company's not working, which happens with Bling sometimes, it's nice to have another option where I can go and maybe pick up a lesson or a few lessons. Or if there's a policy change that you really don't like and can't live with. I've been really lucky with Bling so far. They have honored my contract 100%, which I honestly can't say about most other companies. They've never changed it at the last minute. They've changed it at renewal, but then, you're informed of that before you sign. But they've never changed it after the fact or retroactively applied any new or different policies. And I've always been paid 100% of what I earned, which also has been an issue with some companies. So it's important that you are just aware of the pros and the cons of online teaching because there are both. And you need to weigh them before you make a decision of which company or companies you want to work for. So I hope that was helpful for you guys, and I will see you next time.